Okay, now it's time to finally start talking about object-oriented programming. So, public class OOP introduction. All right. Boom, 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 boom. All right, public static void main string args. Okay, so let's go over what object-oriented programming is and what object-oriented programming is not. What we have mostly been using in this class is something called procedural programming. And procedural programming is pretty simple stuff. It's straightforward. It's something like int x equals y plus 3. Or you might have an array, or maybe some variable. You might say int z equals, and then some procedure or method. Call it method, call, pass in an a, and passes back a z. All right. Well, that's pretty straightforward. You just x equals some mathematical thing, or we have a method that returns something. So how do you create the method return something? Okay, we would have something like public, no, type, public static, and this is going to return an int. So public static int instead of instead of void, because void doesn't return anything, but this is returning an int. So public static int, and then method call. It gets an a, sure, an a is, I don't know, I'll just say int a equals 4. So this is going to be int, and then variable name, there we go. And that's just a regular method. And what this does is some computation, then return some value. And I'll just say int some value equals 6. Why not? But in either case, and with procedural programming, we just do a procedure, or we just do mathematics. It is very straightforward. With method call, all a method does is take all of this computation, and instead of having it here, it's in a method, also known as a function. And of course, we use methods for organization. That's a nice thing. Another interesting thing, methods are also known as functions and procedures. So there's a whole, as you go through your experience as a computer scientist, you will see that methods are also known as functions, they're also known as procedures. So procedural programming just has straightforward computations like x equals y plus 3, a equals 4, z equals method call. And our method call, in this case, all it does is some straightforward computation and return some value. If we were to cut all of this out and put it here, then we wouldn't even need a method or a function or a procedure, all the same thing. But the main thing we use this, why do we use methods? We use methods for reuse and organization. Okay, so that's why we use methods. Methods are pretty straightforward. You can pass in right here as many parameters as you want. So I'll just rename this right here. Parameter 1, parameter 2, etc. You can have it of any type, so this might be an int, this might be a string, whatever. And you have to match them. So this is called method call. It has 2 parameters, parameter 1, parameter 2. The first one's an int, the second one is a string, so I'll pass in a string. There we go. And so the methods have to have the same name and the same number of parameters in the right order. So for example, I can have another method over here. I'll have it exactly the same one here, but it won't have a second parameter. So you might be asking yourself, well, how does Java know if we have method call, which method call to call? And so it would call this one because this has an int and this has a string. This doesn't have a string, and so it won't call it. I can compile it. Yes, I will save it. Same place I always save everything else. It doesn't have a y. That's funny. All right, well, let's put int y equals 5. Why not? All right, so compile is great. And so that's the thing about methods. And a method is also known as a function and procedure, and that's what we do with what we've mostly done with procedural programming, is just straight computation. And if I do have a method or a function or a procedure, in Java we call them all methods, if I do have a method, then all it does is straight computation, and it either returns something or it doesn't return something. Let's have a method that doesn't return anything, so I'll just call method call to, and I'll pass in another string right there. And right here, I'll add public static void because it doesn't return anything. And then I'll call it method call to. And then because this has a string, I need a string for parameter 1. There we go. And what would I do with it? Well, I could do something like system out println and pass in parameter 1. All right. So this method call, where I pass in a string, is the same thing as if I had this line of code, which would replace this one. Now, you might notice that this doesn't match that. So anything you pass in here, like for example, A gets passed in to parameter 1, and this string literal becomes parameter 2. Well, when you call a method, it simply copies whatever's in A and puts it into parameter 1, and copies in whatever in this spot and puts it into parameter 2. So when I have this here, another string, it gets copied and put into this variable that I called parameter 1. I can call the parameter, of course, anything I want. I can call it Goofy or Mickey or whatever I want, but parameter 1 makes sense for this lesson. A parameter is something that doesn't have a value yet. It's just a computation. And so the best way to think of a method is it's sort of like a meat grinder. You put in the meat, it gets put in here, and no matter what happens, the algorithm or the meat gets churned up and goes through no matter what happens. And so these two, this first one, A is argument 1, and a string is argument 2. And so this one has just one argument. So the arguments are when you actually use the method, and that has actual values. So A in this case is 4, so the arguments for method call are 4 and a string, which get passed to the parameters, parameter 1 and parameter 2. And then we do something with them, some computation. That's it. So this is procedural programming. This is what we've been doing all semester. Simple mathematics, simple loops, if statements, all of these things are part of procedural programming. And if I have a method, also known as a function and procedure, then I simply call it and it does something. If it returns something, great, it gives me some value back. Otherwise, I have void and it does not return anything at all.